Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Okay, this is coming out. You can pre-order this right now at Amazon and forgive them their debts. This is a masterpiece written by the master himself, Dr. Michael Hudson. Welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me back, Max.
I've been waiting for this book for a while. This is, I see all the people in the back there, David Graeber and Pertifor, Steve Keen, Paul Craig Roberts, they're all raving about this, and it's really a much-needed book, and especially in the holiday season. You know, I want to talk about chapter 2 here, Jesus' first sermon and the tradition of debt amnesty. In the first reported sermon Jesus delivered upon returning to his native Nazareth, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and announced his mission to restore the year of our Lord. Now, until recently, the meaning of this phrase was not recognized as referring officially to the Jubilee year, but breakthroughs in cuneiform research and a key to the Qumran scroll provide a direct link to that tradition. This linkage provides the basis for understanding how early Christianity emerged in an epoch so impoverished by debt and the threat of bondage that it was called the end time. So now you've been doing research into cuneiform, you've been looking at the tradition of debt forgiveness. We live in an era of the global debt, 400% debt to GDP. It seems like we're in end times.
Yes. It's what they would have called the end time.
Are we, barring the emergence of Jesus Christ and the second coming, what are we going to do?
Well, one of the things that the Babylonians who first developed the concept of the Jubilee year, the word was the same as in Hebrew. The Babylonian word for debt cancellation in Jubilee year was andararim. The Hebrew word was duror. And when the Leviticus laws introduced the Jubilee year to the Bible by the returnees from Babylon, the Jubilee year was word for word what the royal proclamations of Hammurabi and other Babylonian leaders were. And what the Babylonians realized, we actually have their mathematical models that they trained their scribes in. And the mathematical models used in 1800 BC in Babylonia were superior to those used today because they were very simple. They realized that finance was not part of the economy, but grew by its own mathematical laws. And scribes were asked to do two things. One, to calculate compound interest, which grew at the equivalent of 20% a year, doubling in 5 years, quadrupling in 10 years. They also had to project the growth of herds and agriculture, and they grew in an S-curve and tapered off. So for 2,000 years, every ruler of the Near East knew that debts tended to grow faster than the economy's ability to pay. And that became the principle of their economic policy. And what they did was say, when the personal debts, not the business debts, but we're talking about personal agrarian debt, sort of like student loans and credit card debt, grew so large that it would impair the debtor from paying the taxes or serving in the army, and in fact would lead him to run away, which was a big problem, that they'd have to cancel the debts, or else you'd end up looking like modern Greece after the austerity program. If we would have had a free marketer, Milton Friedman would have gone back in a time machine and become the advisor to Hammurabi and said, no, let the market work its way, let the population become all debt servants and bond servants to the public collectors and the rich people, you would have had feudalism occurring 4,000 years earlier than it actually did. So the message for today is we know that the debts can't be paid because the debts grow faster than the economy. So if you don't write them down, one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to have more and more people in the status of student debtors today and credit card debtors, and families that spend all of their wages over subsistence to the banks for interest, or you decide it's not worth sacrificing the economy just to pay the creditors. And the good thing about canceling the debts is not only to free the creditors, but is not only Hammurabi said, but as the Byzantine rulers said, the good thing about canceling debts is you wipe out the savings of the rich people. And the savings of the rich people, they're going to use it, they're going to overthrow us and make a free market economy. And I have the quotations in the books. They're going to try to take over the land and not pay the taxes, just like today. They didn't have offshore banking centers in Byzantium, but they simply didn't pay. And they hired their own armies to fight against the Byzantine rulers. And there was a military war over the debt issue, just as there was in Rome, classical Greece, and the late Bronze Age. So looking at history, you realize number one, that canceling the debts doesn't cause an economic crisis. It's the way to prevent an economic crisis. It's the way to preserve economies with people's heads above water. And once that stops, as it did in Rome, that was we know how Rome ended when it was the first place that didn't cancel the debts. It ended up in feudalism. So that's the model that I think economic analysis should start with.
Wow. And so let's just focus in on one specific metric, if you will. So ancient credit analysis, and you were a credit analyst actually on Wall Street. That's how you started your career. Right. You've been looking at credit in the economy and in the business world for decades. Yep. Now, you make a point there that is one that seems to hinge on this whole story, and that is that compounded rate of interest in the debt grows at a faster rate than the economy can grow at any possible rate to pay down that debt. Yep. You know, Einstein called compounded interest the most destructive force in the universe, or one of the greatest forces in the universe. Right. Here's a guy who was associated with the atomic bomb, and yet he thought compounded interest was incredibly destructive. But when you apply that to debt, you have this problem where it's growing at a pace that's you can't pay it off, and you end up with all these different problems that are associated with it. And so we live in an era today where, you know, everyone in the elite, all the situations are basically repeated. In 2008, that would have been, as we've talked about on the show, the absolute prime point to do a debt jubilee, to bail out the debtors. Instead, the creditors were bailed out. Even Hank Paulson wanted to nationalize Citibank, but he was overruled by Obama, who insisted on bailing out Wall Street. Well,
remember, Obama had submitted the list of cabinet members to Citibank, to the bagman for Wall Street, Tim Geithner, for approval. So Citibank got to name Obama's cabinet, and Sheila Bair also wanted to take over Citibank because she said it was hopelessly incompetent and it was broke, and that it should be taken over. But Geithner and President Clinton's Treasury Secretary, who ran Citibank by that time, overruled him, and Obama then invited the bankers to the White House, and he said, "I'm the only guy standing between you and the mobs and pitchforks, but believe me, my loyalty is to you, the donor class, not to the voters. I'll deliver the voters to you," and that's what he did, and it's still what the Democratic Party is doing today. Both parties basically are saying what people want to hear, but in practice, they want to maintain the debt. And if you look at what the Council of Economic Advisors report, both under Trump and under Obama and under President Bush, they all forecast GDP is growing at compound interest. They say, here's the historical rate, as if GDP will automatically grow. What they don't forecast is debt growing at compound interest, and they don't realize that the GDP's going to grow slower and slower and slower as more and more debt service is used to pay the banks that are not going to relend the money to keep the economy going, but they're going to use it to in-depth the economy even more. So housing prices are going to go up even more. Stock prices will go up, meaning stock yields will go down, bond yields will go down. So basically, by saving the banks, Obama undercut the pension funds, undercut the 401k savings plans, undercut people's ability to save for their retirement without turning their money over to Wall Street and getting taken by the Sharpies, as you have illustrated so often.
Right. So in biblical times, in ancient times, debt was something that occurred you know, people fell behind in taxes, and people that had, they're agrarians, they were farmers, there was a catastrophic force majeure, crops didn't come in, and they accumulated debt, and through no immoral, you know, failing of their person, they were simply part of an economy where debt is kind of erupted, spontaneously, if you will. Right. And so what you're saying is that Jesus, you know, as you point out in the book, this idea of the debt jubilee, to forgive the debt, economically, you do two very powerful things. You keep the farmers and the consumers going about their way without going into debt prison, and you disenfranchise the debt sellers, the debt mongers, the debt, you know, you might get into the whole biblical thing here, you know, who are ruining the economy. Because, and you mentioned Milton Friedman there. So in modern times, you know, Milton Friedman and the Margaret Thatcher era and the era of neoliberalization, they turned debt from a balance sheet item to something that was a growth item, that the faster companies could incur debt. The more you could incur debt, the faster we can securitize it and sell it to some other bank and create this daisy chain. And not only did debt become okay, it became the basis of the economy.
This was a historic change. Never in history did people think that the way to get rich was to go into debt. Down until, I'd say, the 1950s, the whole idea was to pay off the mortgage, not to owe anything, because you knew that once you owed something, you'd tend to fall further and further behind, and you'd get on the debt treadmill. And Babylon knew that, Judah knew that, Rome and Greece knew that, and the idea that you can get rich by going into debt is obviously patter talk and a cover story for the banks and the bondholders that are selling debt. And it doesn't work, and yet that's not the center of the economics curriculum as it should be. What the debt problem, debt didn't appear in the whole economics curriculum all the time I worked through the PhD.
You know, Donald Trump was recently asked about the debt in the United States at $22 trillion, and he said, well, you know, I'm not going to be around much to have to deal with it. So it's just pushing that into the future. We only have about 30 seconds. I'm going to have to cut you off, and we're going to bring you back on a second segment. But Donald Trump obviously would not be featured as one of the good guys in the Bible.
Well, even when he did owe money, he didn't pay his debts to the banks, and no bank would lend to him at all. So you'd think he'd be friendly towards this, but
sure.
He knew who his campaign contributors were.
All right. Well, we'll pick this up in another segment. Thanks for being on this episode of the Keiser Report. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. The new book is called And Forgive Them Their Debts. It's an instant classic. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. I highly recommend it. The book of the year. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.